Welcome to the Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor. Now, here's your host, Tom Lindquist.
Glad to have you back in the Leadership Lyceum, where we bring you direct access to top CEOs and directors of boards in an interview format that provides insight on situational issues that confront CEOs every day. It is a CEO's virtual mentor. Welcome to episode 7. We have a novel episode for you today with not one but 3 guests. I'm joined by 2 recently retired utility CEOs and a highly regarded member of both of their boards. These are McKinsey & Company Emeritus Dr. Les Silverman, former lead independent director of Pepco and independent director of Columbia Pipeline Group. Mr. Robert Bob Skaggs, former CEO of NiSource and then CEO of CPG, and Mr. Joseph Joe Rigby, former Chief Executive Officer of Pepco. As a board member for both companies, Les Silverman was at the vertex of notable M&A transactions that took place under the leadership of each of these CEOs over the last 2 years. At NiSource, Bob Skaggs presided over the separation of the gas storage and transmission assets from the regulated utility. Bob led CPG's spinoff from NiSource into a standalone publicly traded company in July 2015, and the subsequent sale of CPG to TransCanada 1 year later. At Pepco, Joe Rigby led the sale of Pepco to Exelon. The NiSource CPG transaction unfolded in a relatively smooth and speedy manner, while the Pepco acquisition could only be described as epic and protracted. My fabulous foursome gathered in early autumn of this year in the Pepco offices in Washington, D.C., in one of the rooms where it happened several months after the completion of their transactions, to reflect on the deliberations and perspectives of these executives and one of the non-executive directors who made it all happen. We'll be right back to join the interview.
No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one else was in the room where it happened, the room where it happened, the room where it happened. No one really knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens, but no one else is in the room where it happens.
That's Lin-Manuel Miranda's The Room Where It Happens from the hit Broadway musical Hamilton. Let's jump in with Bob Skaggs giving some background and context on NiSource before their spin of the midstream assets.
At NiSource, the company was comprised of a significant, large, multi-state utility. But we also had a pipeline company and a midstream company that was just beginning to grow. Over the course of several years at NiSource, we in the board asked ourselves, does that combination of assets make sense? Do the risk profiles match up? Are the businesses compatible? What are the financing requirements as both companies began to grow? Mm-hmm. So over a period of years, we asked that question. There were certainly strong points of view initially that the companies belonged together, that there was strength because they were in different parts of the industry. But as both companies began to grow and the demands for capital began to increase dramatically, and the risk profiles diverged as pipeline companies became quasi-unregulated, the board and our advisors took a different look. And over a period of time and quite a bit of study and deliberation, ultimately concluded that the utility should stand alone with its own capital structure, its own credit rating, its own risk profile, and that the pipeline was better suited to be on its own. So that was the background in the genesis. We tried to use a thoughtful, deliberative process to come to the right answer for our shareholders and our stakeholders, and I'll underscore stakeholders. And as a management team and as a board, there's emotion, there's ownership. Reaching the decision to split up a company that's really doing quite well and thriving was a really momentous decision.
Joe, were you all looking at various strategic alternatives for the business? Were you looking to acquire other companies at one point and then determine to sell Pepco, or how did everything evolve with what ultimately happened?
Well, I'll try to draw some points together. I guess where I would start is we were a company that was formed from mergers. So company I actually started, this the transaction with Exelon is the third merger I've gone through. And had somewhat of a sense that every once in a while, on a macro level, the industry may look at M&A as an opportunity to grow in a non-organic way. I would say that, and not just because he's sitting here, but at the time that I became the CEO, Les was the chair of our finance committee. And probably like many other companies, we had an annual strategic planning process, and part of that discussion with the board always included a discussion of the M&A landscape. We were very fortunate to have many investment bankers who were willing to come in and talk to us about these possibilities. But I think what is a little bit unique about us is that we went through two very difficult situations. The first one was, I'll say, an internal but financial challenge. We had generating plants. We were long-winded way. We were not the right owner for those plants. So we sold those plants, and we were going to use the proceeds to bolster the balance sheet and then build the utility. So we got through that.
And this is what time frame?
This would have been in 2009 and 10.
Okay.
And then in the latter part of 2010, we entered a very difficult period of operational reliability issues, particularly here in the DC area. What happened to us beyond that was that we were faced with 2 or 3 year period of time where we were really, really challenged to earn our allowed returns. And I can remember at the latter part of 2012, and I don't know if I've ever even mentioned this particular thing to Les, but I remember going into that planning retreat in September of 2012, and part of the discussion resulted in, if we can't get better outcomes here, in terms of what our return to our shareholders, we may have to look at other options. And that, coincidental with my own view that consolidation in the industry was a possibility, and the fact that we were improving, I understood we were going to become more attractive over time. Fast forward into 2013, I had made a decision that, I wanted to retire. I had put in 35 years at that point. And it was funny, Les was about to become, in the next year, he was going to be our next lead independent director. Mm-hmm. So I had the benefit of his background on the finance committee side, knowing the role he was going to take with the board. And I remember at a board meeting us talking about that as we go through the succession process, we should not be surprised that we receive offers. So, long-winded way to say, in some ways, I felt that the expression of interest was somewhat inevitable. Mm-hmm. And it was also a point where I think the board and I were chewing on what we may have to do simply to get the return to our shareholders. As it played out, the day after I announced my retirement, I got a phone call from Chris Crane. So it was pretty quick when that expression came in. But I don't think we were surprised. We had been talking about it anyway from a planning point of view, and then I think as time was going on, it was something that was increasingly becoming an option that we would really have to consider.
You mentioned Chris Crane calling. Was that maybe the special moment that accelerated everything, or was there a process going on?
I've known Chris for several years, mm-hmm. and he and I worked very closely on some cybersecurity issues. And I remember being at a dinner with him, and this would have been in December of 2013. And he mentioned to me that he would like to talk to me, and I reached out to Les and a gentleman by the name of Frank Heinz to say, hey, this was. I don't think he just wants to ask me, who my favorite team is.
Right,
I thought it was kind of like, I think I know where this is going.
It's typically the way those calls go.
Yeah. And so when the next month rolled around and we were making the announcement about my retirement plans, I think the board was maybe surprised that it came in so quick, but the fact that it happened was not really a surprise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the protocol then is?
We have a very scripted, even what I'm supposed to be saying to my counterpart, immediately contacting our general counsel and keeping some level of notes, but not too many notes, mm-hmm. and but also alerting the board. So once that occurred, the board shifted into to Bob's point, it was a very deliberative process, getting the right advisors in. And the point Bob was making, it's a moment that is, I think, a combination of maybe to some degree disappointment, you wanting to be able to be successful independently.
Yep.
I think it's a moment of reality. There's some excitement. Hey, someone really likes us.
But it's very sobering.
Yeah, it is.
It's a very sobering moment.
And I think it's one of the things that's, I think, and this was not the first time in our history we had been approached, to the point about it being sobering. I think it's healthy when you had that situation to take a really hard look in the mirror and compare your standalone plan to what the possibilities are.
I want to emphasize that these two guys are both thoughtful, and they lead very deliberative, thoughtful, strategic planning processes. So as a board member of both companies, it was always on the table that either being acquired or, for that matter, acquiring others was an option. And it was part, as Joe indicated, it was certainly part of our annual process at Pepco. I wasn't around for that many processes at Columbia, but from the very first discussion I had as the new guy on the block joining the board when Columbia Pipeline Group was spun off from NiSource, I was the one new director added at the time. Right from the very beginning, there was a discussion of under what circumstances would it be interesting to entertain offers, and under what circumstances might we, in fact, go looking for others. So in neither situation was this unexpected or surprising. But there is, of course, that moment that this one is serious, and we've got to take it seriously.
What kind of level of detail do you hear at that point in time?
Well, as you know, this is a journey, and it starts with the toe in the water, and then you get in a little deeper, and at some point you can pull back gracefully. And we did on several occasions at Pepco over the years have offers that were at various degrees of seriousness. We certainly, as I think both these guys indicated, had bankers in telling us that this was a good time or it wasn't for any particular type of transaction. But in both companies, I think my perspective is from the very moment I was in discussions with Bob about joining the Columbia Pipeline Group, I became impressed with the tremendous set of opportunities Columbia faced as the dominant, or I'll say one of the dominant players in the Marcellus and Utica shale areas, the most prolific gas areas in the country, if not the world. And Columbia had a fabulous set of opportunities, which these guys had carefully developed. That was the good news. The not so good news is it required an enormous amount of capital. And we knew that. We didn't know exactly what our options would be over time. We didn't know exactly the role that others might play in helping meet those capital needs. But it was certainly part of the picture from the very beginning. On the Pepco side, as Joe indicated, there were a series of challenges, but also opportunities. Joe and his team really cleaned up the PHI operation to where we were a well-performing, pure-play utility. Well, that opened up some other options for us. At the same time, it made us attractive. So I guess the point I'm making is these transactions are always on the mind of board members. And when that call comes, we knew how to move and act.
And I'd just add, Joe mentioned it and Les alluded to this. This process really incents you to have a good, clear view of your plan. And that is a really deep, granular, thoughtful analysis. And you really do use outside advisors to help kick the tires. You help the board. The board helps you take a look at those plans, but you need a crystal clear view of your plan. And Les hit the nail on the head. We were blessed with incredible growth, but we also knew we had this incredible financing need that was going to be a challenge under the best of market circumstances. You have to look at that with clear eyes and clear thinking. And so just to give you a little bit of the process, so we spin in July of 2015, and this is public information. It's disclosed in the proxy that went along with the transaction. We didn't receive a call quite as quickly as Joe did after his announcement, but within a matter of days after the spin, we had our first approach from an interested person. Then you get to the offer, right? And that too is scrutinized with a lot of care and a lot of thought. Our transaction, although it proceeded fairly quickly, I don't think we shortchanged or short-circuited the deliberation process.
Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with Les Silverman, Bob Skaggs, and Joe Rigby. Stay tuned.
I think it's interesting between your experience, Bob, and Joe, your experience. You talk about the realization when it becomes real. There's a moment there where all different sorts of emotions are going for you as you're retiring and you're leaving a legacy in that respect. And Bob, for you, you're executing these transactions without retirement really in mind.
Bob's career was not irrelevant to the way the board thought about the Columbia transaction, though. Bob emphasized the clear thinking about the strategic plan, but from the board perspective, that's crucial, but you also need a management team to execute that plan. And part of your thinking on the board about the value of a company going forward and how to think about that in the context of a potential transaction is the leaders of the company who are going to carry out that plan. Bob had let us know that his retirement was not necessarily a long ways away.
I see.
And that becomes a factor in thinking about, is this the time and is this the offer? The numbers are important, but the people behind the numbers are also important.
Expand on that a little bit, Les, as the board looks at that and looks at a retirement. From my vantage point of search, we always think, well, we can go out and find a worthy successor, but it's interesting from a board standpoint that you might look at that retirement as who's going to run this company and create the value that...
Absolutely.
And that weighs into the decisioning on...
And this, our Columbia board had enormous confidence in Bob. We had enormous confidence in the team Bob had built. But in thinking about the future against which we would compare an offer, we had to think about who that management team was going to be down the road. And while some of those executives were probably, no doubt, were employed by the company at the time, some new faces would appear, and that's always a bit of a uncertain aspect that you have to factor into thinking about the offer.
You know, it's interesting. 6 months. It was we closed this transaction six months ago. This past Friday, so I've had time to maybe replay all this in my mind. But one thing that I would offer to you is that even though we had a planning process that could at least contemplate M&A, it was not the plan to sell the company. Even the succession, the energy, and I think it's important to note that the energy and the drive across the board and the management team was to run as an independent company. Mm-hmm. So, and I think in some ways it's a little bit frustrating, at least from my experience, that outside looking in, people think, well, you just got this compelling offer, and all the shareholder value, and the compensation to the executives, but what is the fact is that the drive and the motivation was to run the company independently.
I would amplify and underscore that in our case as well. We spun that company out with all the intent to run it as a standalone growing company. That was the complete expectation. In fact, the board wanted to ensure that we were positioned to do that.
We were, it was interesting just as I think back to getting the initial discussion with Chris Crane, and I'll say the clarity that he brought from a commercial point of view of what the opportunity was. I think when we discussed this at the board, we were kind of in an intellectual place of thinking about this as a possibility. It was helpful in the way Chris in a very granular way, explained from their point of view why this fit into their strategy, to the point where I think we were able to go through that intellectual exercise and see the possibilities. Doing this somewhat from memory, I think that would have occurred sometime in the middle of January. By the end of February, we had reached a point where we thought, you know what, we really want to do this in a more fulsome way, not just take it out to any bidder, but to assess this offer with perhaps other expressions of interest to get a more fulsome view, to the point where, and to the point Bob was making, is we got later in the process and we saw that in a very honest view of what we thought the future was at the company on a standalone basis, it was clear that this future was going to be better.
Right.
And not just from a shareholder point of view, on every dimension. In fact, there was a slide, and because it came up pretty in my testimony when I was on the stand, of assessing this transaction in its totality across all the stakeholders. And it was very clear that this future was better for every one of those stakeholders.
It sounds that Chris's clarity that he brought to that discussion, that was instrumental in what you had envisioned.
Well, it allowed me to go back to the board with more than just hey, I got a phone call.
Yeah.
Right.
We actually had a chance to meet. He put together a document which became discoverable, which is important that as you're going through this, that everything, your text messages, everything is going to be discovered. And you think you have to be careful about that. You have to be thoughtful. But in that presentation, it was very clear to see what their motivation was. What we were fortunate to find out was that not only were they motivated over the course of a long process, but they really stayed in, in spite of some real challenges, to see this through. And I think that's a major point that the board had to get comfortable with. Is this partner going to stick in here with? We had four very different state jurisdictions plus FERC. You had to be able to think through, can we get this to the finish line all over the place?
Again, I'd amplify what Joe is saying. You look at the numbers that are laid in front of you, but you look at who that purchaser is. Is there logic? Can they finance? Can they execute? Frankly, how are they going to treat your stakeholders? To Joe's point, your employees, your customers, your regulators, your communities. All of that goes into the equation. Certainly, you've got to do what's right for the shareholders, but the other stakeholders are very, very relevant in the consideration.
And that brings up what I found really important from the board perspective, is that in each case, we had multiple bidders for the company. And running that process in a way that preserved the option for the company not to sell, because as both of these guys indicated, that was not the plan. The plan was not selling the company. The plan was to run it. Having received one interesting offer in both cases, a process was started to invite others to suggest interest. Did I put that right, Joe?
That was very well stated.
We were not selling the company. We were not putting it up for sale, but we were inviting others to show interest. And that process and how we got there was crucial in the Pepco case, because what you're always hoping for are two really interested bidders. And we had those two emerged, one of which was Exelon, from the process that Joe helped lead. And it put us in a very strong negotiating position. I think in Columbia, we had a similar situation with multiple interested parties. And that gave the board the confidence that we weren't comparing, one bidder against how we do on our own. In fact, we had multiple bidders expressing interest. And that just gave us more of a sense that there was something here we had to take a good look at.
Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with Les Silverman, Bob Skaggs, and Joe Rigby. Stay tuned.
Just as you as CEOs go through emotions about transactions that are coming, and you think about yourself in that regard. I can imagine individual board members are also going through a bit. Everyone may have a different value that they ascribe to being on the board. What did you observe around the boardroom table just in that? Were there any interesting observations there?
Before we get to Pepco, I might just jump in, because as I indicated before, I was the new guy on the block. The 6 of the 7 independent directors at Columbia Pipeline Group had come from the NiSource side. I was new. And I didn't want to do this transaction, personally. I was enjoying this board. I loved working with Bob, who I had known for many years, back from my McKinsey days. The team Bob had put together, first-rate business people. And I really wanted to keep doing that. But that wasn't an option, because when I looked at it as a board member, we came to the right decision. I also want to say, and this will come up in the Pepco case as well, it's not just board members who are conflicted by this. We talked about CEOs facing retirement, but a lot of the senior staff who are instrumental in making these deals happen, both in terms of the analysis leading up to the board decision and then the execution. A number of these individuals they had uncertain futures, and yet I never saw anything but complete professionalism and dedication to, as Bob put it, doing the right thing. And boy, as a board member, you see that, and you're really appreciative. And it has a lot of it, of course, has to do with the leadership of these two guys.
Yes.
I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure this experience Bob had was, I think for a company, the further up you go, I think sometimes people just equate it with authority, power, and money. But my experience, and the experience I had with my board, is that there's a buy-in and a commitment that's at a very deep emotional level. It was never lost on me the incredible honor it is to run a company, to lead a company. And so when we were going through this process, if I back up even before the offer came in, probably one of the great things that I feel like we accomplished as a company was we had severely damaged our brand here. And we had worked our way through to the point where we weren't just in a recovery mode. We had really almost come back. And I think in many ways that almost galvanized the pride that the board felt, which in some ways also became a little bit more of an issue when we were thinking about the possibility of selling the company, because we had just, we got back on track. And so it was interesting to me to observe a deep emotional connection simultaneous to going through the intellectual process of assessing the offer. But everybody got there. On the other side of it, it's almost a two-part story. I think we did a good job of calibrating expectations on the boards and to the street side that this transaction would probably take 12 to 15 months, simply because we were going to have to go through multiple jurisdictions. So in some ways, it was not overly difficult, in my opinion, to manage the company, because I had an expectation and we set it up in a way that our meetings were about talking about the merger, but also talking about operational issues, not too much about a different future. So we weren't kind of, I'll say, distracted from trying to do planning for a future that we didn't envision happening. That all changed in August of 2015 when the merger was denied in DC, and that was a significant challenge to really kind of calm everybody that even if the merger failed, it would be survivable, but we were still going to make an effort to get this back on track. And I would say that next 7 to 8 month period, that what became from 12 to 15 months that actually went up to 23 months, was a much more difficult time to simultaneously be planning for a different future and still trying to keep the transaction on track. And to be candid, having a lot more doubt as to whether this was going to get done, and to make sure that we were doing our job at the management, but also at the board level, to be ready to go if the transaction failed. and to, I mean, literally the next day, knowing exactly what you were going to do first to start to kind of send out a different message to various constituencies about what this company was going to be.
Joe, how did you do that? I mean, you're walking around with this doubt, but you're probably showing a different face to the organization.
Well, you know, one of the best, I'm sure, Bob, one of the best things about a board is that it gives the CEO a place to be someone who doesn't have to project. You obviously want to project confidence, but you can be more yourself versus, you know, the image you need to project to the rest of the company of absolute confidence. Yeah, I felt confident, but, you know, I'm human. I have doubts and I have concerns about things. It was much more of, let's get focused around what we have to do to get this back on track, but also be super prepared if the deal does in fact fail.
When we were first considering the decision to go ahead with the merger, the attorney we had hired, kind of Joe Frumpkin from Sullivan Cromwell, who turned out to be the attorney for Columbia at a later point. I remember Joe Frumpkin saying to our board, once you decide to go ahead with this, your role changes completely. That you have really very little to do with driving the company, but you'll have a lot to do with saving it if the merger doesn't go through. And as in many things he told us, Joe was right on target. Joe Frumpkin, that is. And we spent most of the next 23 months in the boardroom talking about what to do if the merger failed. Because that was the only thing, other than keeping our management team appropriately incented to keep delivering the value to the acquirer, the only job we had was to be prepared to run the company, oversee the running of the company, if the merger failed. So we had just one bleak scenario after another for 23 months. And because, as Joe said, we had to be ready. We had to know what to do if the merger failed, which could have happened at any point and certainly seemed quite possible, if not even likely, toward the latter part of this process.
I'd say keeping the team and the organization focused on doing their day-to-day activities. It's one of your primary objectives throughout the entire process, because you don't know when a transaction will not get across the finish line. It's kind of interesting. We didn't have this sort of situation where there was political, regulatory uncertainty, but if I think back to what happened at NiSource and Columbia Pipeline, we announced that we were going to spin and separate the company in the fall of 14, and we were going to do it effective the middle of 15. So we had an organization under uncertainty. They were going through this separation. They were doing incredible amounts of work on a very fast track to separate the company, but we still had to move gas, produce electricity, and do all those sorts of things, even when we were separating the company and doing all that work. And the board was a great ally. The senior leadership and the folks out in the field just did a wonderful job of just doing what they do.
For you two CEOs mentally, this compartmentalization of the issues is a very, very difficult human nature problem, because you're focused on the excitement of the transaction probably, but you're also having to keep everybody focused on the operations. How do you split your personality to do that?
It's probably the experience that you've had growing up in the business. Joe mentioned 35 years. I had 35 years. We were involved in a number of corporate transactions. In fact, NiSource was the product of what started out as a hostile takeover. Our company had been in bankruptcy. At least part of the company had been in bankruptcy, and Les had worked with us closely prior to that unfortunate event. So I think it's the ability that you gain with experience of dealing with multiple issues at multiple levels, and always understanding the folks doing the job day to day is what you really got to focus on. And you do have to be pretty adept at compartmentalizing or segueing from one situation to the next. Absolutely. You've got to be adept.
I think just thinking about all that, I go back to when I became CEO in 2009. One of the things I did every year, I would go out and talk to every employee. Would maybe take us over the course of 3 or 4 weeks to go talk to all 5,000. So I had a channel to go out and actually talk to everybody about what was going on. Mm-hmm. And the company was small enough to you could do something like that over a reasonable period of time to engage them as to why we did this. So I think on a broad level with all the employees, I had a sense that they were hearing this directly from me, coming from the boardroom as to why we did that. I think the other interesting thing is most of the people that worked here, they're probably same in Bob's case, that they're long tenured employees. This was not their first rodeo. They had seen this before. They understood that it's survivable. It's maybe even an opportunity to thrive. Great credit goes to Exelon because on a people level, it was relatively painless in that I'll say the redundancies, whatever separations really took place on a voluntary basis. So people were given an opportunity to choose. We had those the perverse thing of people being disappointed that they were going to have to stay employed. That's kind of what they may have seen as a good time in their life to leave. It's like, no, unfortunately, we need you to keep working. So I think in some strange way, people were so primed for the transaction to be done that when it failed initially, it was much more of an anxiety that people were feeling now that it wasn't going to get done. Mm-hmm. There was some relief, but for the most part, people had geared themselves up to a different future. And I recall feeling challenged around trying to continue a message that we can get this thing done because, the most recent evidence was that it was going to be even harder than we thought it was going to be. Mm-hmm. But, candidly, at the end, it was more of a surprise that they approved it. And I remember, probably way more than you want to know, but we got the order at 2:00. Les called me at 2:05, wanted to know what the hell's going on because he just saw the stock price jump up. I said, you're not going to believe it. They've approved the merger. He comes over here to this building, and around 3:00, we get the order. We read the order. At 3:15, Exelon had moved money into the Wells Fargo account, and at 5:00, we closed the transaction, and I was unemployed.
Yeah. Oh, my God.
So other than that, it was just a same old day at the office.
That ends part 1 of 2 of this novel discussion with Les Silverman, Bob Skaggs, and Joe Rigby. While much has been written about the legal, financial, strategic, and operational details of these transactions, the complex human and social interactions that lead to these monumental decisions usually go unexamined. Stay tuned for part 2 of 2, coming up soon. The Leadership Lyceum, a CEO's virtual mentor, has been a production of the Leadership Lyceum, LLC, copyright 2016, all rights reserved. Come back and listen. It's lonely at the top.